Hello and welcome to Incorruptible Mass. You are here and we are excited to help you understand state politics. So we talk a lot about how broken it is, what we could have here in Massachusetts if we fixed it, and how you can get involved. And today is what we could have in Massachusetts if we fixed it. We thought, how great would it be to really do a little visioning, do a little New Year's resolutions on things that we believe we should have, that we should fight for. And so that's today. Before we go on, let me introduce my two totally amazing co-hosts, Jordan Berg-Powers.
My name is Jordan Burke-Powers. I use he, him, and I have 13 years working on statewide electoral politics in Massachusetts.
And Jonathan Cohn.
Jonathan Cohn, he, him, his, based out of Boston. Also been spending a number of years doing electoral and issue-based advocacy here in Massachusetts, and happy to talk about what should be happening next year and beyond.
I am Anna Callahan, she, her, coming at you from Medford. Been exclusively doing local and state politics for, about 8 years now. And always super excited about state politics here in Massachusetts. So I want to start off, let's just be clear about that these visions are not things that we believe our legislature is dying to make happen. Who wants to jump in and talk a little bit about how our legislature blocks reforms and really prevents a lot of these things from going through?
Well, I guess I'll just start by saying, I think the thing that I've come to, and probably the thing I repeat the most when I talk to people about Massachusetts politics, is that there isn't a governing philosophy for the Democrats in charge in Massachusetts. There isn't a clear, here's the vision of what we want this state to look like. Here's where we think it should go. Our state doesn't have a governing philosophy. It's not just not neoliberalism or progressive or socialist or even conservative. It has no governing philosophy. It doesn't have goals. It doesn't have trying to fix things, because it largely believes things are fine. And the only thing it really wants to do is tinker at the edges. Its biggest vision is to make everything be a little bit okay, right? Like they see, while those of us who see a lot of impending things happening in our state is the Titanic, and we're trying to steer us away from hitting directly into an iceberg, most of Massachusetts legislators, and especially the leadership of Massachusetts, they're just playing a good tune on the top of the Titanic. Just like, I don't really see what the problem is, right? And so I think that's really, when I come to it, that's mostly what I see in Massachusetts. And Jonathan, you had a really great line about
my comment about that we should discuss New Year's resolutions for the legislature because they're often not reflective enough to have some for themselves. Which is true, because it's an interesting as well when you think about, to your point, Jordan, that if we have a situation, although Massachusetts can elect unfortunately Republican governors, we have a guaranteed continuation of a Democratic supermajority. It's been that for a long time, and will continue to be. And if you have that type of governing majority, you could be thinking about, we want to have this problem solved by X date, or this number should be down to number X should be down to number Y by this date. And you can have that mix of, and sometimes a goal gets passed into policy, sometimes it exists outside of it, and it might just even be expressed rhetorically as something to inform policy. But a real kind of set of why this governing majority deserves to keep being the governing majority and to deliver the benefits that a governing majority can have. And it does. And it's the thing that I always think is kind of interesting, where you have the places, and not always, but the places where you sometimes see some of the biggest flurries of actions are majorities that view themselves as precarious because they think they could lose. And so they want to both try to earn their keep and use power while they have it.
And I was going to mention something like that. I'll just jump in for 1 second and go back to you, that in a one-party state, it is really hard to see progress happening because there's no danger of the Democrats ever being out of power. So why should they pass things? They don't actually have to do anything in terms of the party itself.
Yeah, like, and where like the only real like avenue is through is through primaries, because the general, like, there are like very few districts where Republican is competitive in Massachusetts, and like I am in some ways very happy that Republicans don't manage to be competitive. They're a toxic political party. However, at this, like, and like the fewer of them elected, the better. But at the same time, you have a kind of the comfort of always knowing that you'll have your majority, and that you don't really need like that. Even like bottom barrel turnout won't prevent you from keeping your majority. Ends up reducing a sense of ambition.
Yeah, and I'll only say one more thing, which is that the leadership, the speaker and the leadership team and the folks sort of behind the speaker that like fund him and everything, they really are they spend quite an effort ensuring that really progressive policies that would benefit the vast majority of people in Massachusetts, the ones we're about to talk about, do not pass. So they spend a lot of energy obstructing the passage of policies that would genuinely benefit the vast majority of people in Massachusetts.
And one thing I would add,
I just want to say really quickly, far be it for me to disagree, Anna. I would sadly say that they don't spend a lot of energy on it at all, because they don't have to, because no one's pushing them in the legislature. They, the legislators who we elect don't care enough to push it. They're not bought in enough on making people's lives better enough to push hard, to demand, to be out on the steps every day screaming, why aren't they doing these things? Our leadership is relatively comfortable in doing basically nothing, because they have literally no pushback from it. And the majority of the effort is made by pseudo progressives to tell real progressives to sit out and shut up.
Like, sure, but when we get to the education thing, I'll mention some stuff that is. They do spend some effort. They will like have the phone call tree go out, have all the progressive representatives call all of the other folks who are in their milieu to like hard pressure to, oh my God, you had a challenger at an event because that challenger agrees with the policy you want. Like, God forbid, they do these things. They don't spend no energy. They're, so anyway, that is here or there.
Also, one thing that's kind of exists in like a milieu in between both of those, of one, I think even beyond any policy intent, one problem that exists with both chambers is if you've over centralized yourself. It's like the combination of no large scale vision exacerbated by an over centralization, because the over centralization creates a bottleneck effect. That if you have too few people who are planning to be in charge, it's harder for things to get through. And it's harder for new ideas to get heard. It's harder even for urgency to get registered if it's not coming from one of the top people, because it's been designed that way to not be receiving. And I thought that was Tammy Gravea kind of alluded to that dynamic in her farewell speech. And I think that's definitely an important one about how the body's not really doesn't design itself to take in new input in the way that it should. Excuse me, I was going to note to Jordan's point, I do think it's also, and could be a conversation for a different day, about how far more legislators need to actually be champions of the bills that they themselves file, in a way that not all of them are.
And with that, we leave the realm of sucky, how much the Massachusetts legislature sucks, and we enter the realm of what could we have if we fixed it? I'm going to pass it to Jordan. Jordan, I think you were going to talk a little bit about our housing crisis.
I guess I wasn't really going to be positive on it. I was really going to get into the fact that it's a disaster. And I think for me, the housing crisis, more than any other crisis, really, the unaffordability generally to get around is a real crisis if you talk to regular people. People are really worried about it. And it's been a problem for a long time. It's a weird thing that in Massachusetts, the way in which you sort of inherent the way you buy a home for a lot of people, especially on the Cape, is you wait for old people to die and you take it from them when they die. Like, that's a terrible way to think about housing policy, or to think about people owning housing and so forth. And it's largely unregulated. It's largely without vision. Our state does not have a housing policy. I mean, it doesn't have even things that don't work, like the healthcare commission to keep healthcare costs down, have something. There's a judiciary to keep our criminal justice somewhat, supposedly, like there is no thing that oversees our housing policy in any real way, that tries to rein it in, that tries to think about it, that tries to put together some sort of vision for how we can make it affordable here, let alone make it so that we can get around, let alone so that we do things that we know work, which is not house poor people just with other poor people, but disperse opportunity and living opportunity among every neighborhood, every corner of the state. We don't do any of those things. And so, we are without real housing vision, and our legislature is totally, to hear our legislator talk about it, oh, I don't know, like we're maybe 20 years away from having this real problem. Like, they have no urgency around it. They're not doing anything. They threw, look, we threw somebody at the pores. What do you want us to do? Like, they would take a victory lap about it. Like, that's not gonna solve the problem. Like, it's just a little drop in the bucket of the unaffordability. There was a good report. There's a, about the total lack of things, and the things that we're pushing are so modest compared to the problems that it is. Rent control is simply saying that you need to hold it within the means of inflation. We had 7% inflation this year. Like, that should not be a wild request.
And actually, that's not even rent control that we're trying to pass. Like, the rent control we're trying to pass is simply saying that a city could set
but if you were to pass
any limit.
If you were to pass the most like what people want for rent control, I know it's updating. I know they're trying to get restricted, but some of the things that were bills that we're trying to pass were simply just like, I think 3 times inflation, something ridiculous, right? It was just modest, like some controls. And if you think about that and you think, like, well, that's bonkers, Jordan, you want controls on your food. You wouldn't allow a wild throw with food. You want somebody to say that could kill us, don't put that in the food, right? Like, we have controls everywhere. You can't go on the street and say, I'm a doctor, come to me. We have a licensing process because we recognize that just allowing a free-for-all of so-called medical advice is detrimental to us as a society. I can't go into a courthouse and say, I'm practicing law today. That's a free-for-all. There's no controls over that. But we license it. We say that that's not how we want it. And for housing, if you say, we really need to put some controls on this to just have some semblance of any tether to reality, we can't even vision that out. We have to vision out something smaller, which is giving cities the ability to maybe do it. And so we're really, when it comes to housing, which for most people is a ginormous crisis, they are 1 or 2 paychecks away from being on the street. Our legislature has no vision, no action, and no plan.
The one thing I often say to people when it comes to something like rent control is that part of the ultimate question is, how long should it take for rent to double? Most people don't think that rent should be able to double in a year because, like, that's evil. And if you agree that it shouldn't be able to double in the year, that you accepted that there should be some type of limit, and the question is, how many years is that? Or as some folks know, like, mortgage payments are standard. You're giving people a sense of regularity in the payments that they get. And, like, why should a renter not be given that same decency of knowing what to expect going out a few years, barring like kind of large inflationary changes, but like some degree of regularity so that you have the ability to plan. And that's something that's not even doing all of the other work of ensure that somebody can live in an area long term, because maybe that they would ultimately be priced out by any increase. And there are things that need to do to address that, but to just provide that degree of stability that it does, while you can address the fact, like, all of the other issues that exist kind of in the housing market, as well as like the number of, like, the one thing I'll just add to that is how beyond just making it so like that the state, both in terms of using state-owned land or city-owned land, and the power, both the power that you have in terms of that being lucrative and the demands that you can make with anything that goes on that land, combined with the fact that like the state should just get back into the business of building itself.
Yeah. And I'm going to just touch, Jordan, you like went super fast over some great topics. Just to put a point on it, that this idea of like, hey, if the state owns land, if the state builds, housing, Jordan, what you were talking about with not like exclusively putting poor people all in one, area, like public housing, really could be social housing, where, it's for everybody. And there are places in the world that already do this and do a great job, and people love it, and it's fantastic. So we're not talking about anything brand new.
And we have places like that already exist that just need to be like the models. Like I think of like Tent City in Boston, which is the achievement from Mel King, which is kind of designed to be like a kind of a mixed income community that provides a lot of housing for low income individuals, but also has units that aren't, to make it so that it's not just concentrating poverty in one place. And I would often say that, like, I was thinking recently I should start going to like local zoning meetings and like talk up the fact that my building itself is a building where several floors are run by social services nonprofits. I live in one of the market units that's actually, I have like kind of a de facto rent control that doesn't because of the landlord, but like a few of the floors are social services units mixed in with other floors that end up being market units that people like often end up being students. But we should have more buildings zoned like that it's on a block of a T-stop near a bunch of amenities, and is designed for people of varying incomes to live in the same space.
So I'm going to go ahead and push us along. And I really want to talk about healthcare, because this whole idea of it is always amazing to me when people push back against our readiness to have universal healthcare, to have a sort of Medicare for all style healthcare, because most countries in the world did this stuff like 70 years ago, 50 years ago, like sometimes more. This is nothing new. This is in fact the absolute norm in most of the rest of the world. And for us to say that like, oh, it's too radical, it's too this, it's too that, it's expensive, it's whatever, like all these things are, they're crazy. Like it is crazy. This obviously is like the correct answer and has been proven for decades and decades and decades. And so it really, like, sometimes I feel like we got to like shake things up a little bit and be like, okay, hang on. Let's like not be so American centric. And let's just look at like the whole rest of the world and how that is beloved by people in every westernized country, plus tons and tons of other countries. I mean, this is the norm. And insurance is getting worse and worse, more and more expensive. They're denying more and more claims. It is, I believe, a genuine crisis. And it's so unnecessary because there's no experimentation needed. There's no, like, this is just something that we know how to do. And if we cannot pass it in Massachusetts, like, what is wrong? We should be passing this, and we should be passing it with an eye to getting it passed nationally in the United States.
No, and I think, like, actually, just to kind of iterate a point, kind of, Anna, that you were making before, that it's striking that, especially coming out of a pandemic, which we're not fully coming out of, I guess, being like on the hopefully tail ends of, that there wasn't any large scale, like, continued attention by policymakers to, we have serious failings within our healthcare system, that and how do we make structural reforms there, especially knowing that you have a state like Massachusetts, where we're close to universal, but again, close to universal means not universal, which is also, I think, which always is.
Well, we have universal health insurance. We don't have universal care, free to the point of care.
It's totally like the insurance is universal. Your ability to use your insurance is a separate issue, which leads to the chronic like issue of underinsurance, or that you can still have medical bankruptcy exist in a case of near universal. And it's like, and I'll reference another intersect, but just the idea that when it's talked about as being universal, when it's actually like 90, I think it's like 97%, is just a kind of a weird, like something that's 97% full isn't full.
Right. But see, what the thing I want to point is like, to me, this whole talk of like, oh, well, we're 97%, insured. That doesn't mean jack. I mean, under COVID, listen, under COVID, what was one of the worst things that happened during COVID is people didn't go to the doctor to get tested. They went to work not knowing whether they had it. Tests were unavailable. I mean, this is absurdity, absurdity. And, there was a study done by, I forget who, that said that like minimum like 330,000 people in America died during COVID because they didn't have health insurance. And I mean, what are we thinking? It is truly remarkable that did not become a giant issue, that nobody, politicians down to like, just us, average, regular people, did not like throw a fit because we did not have universal.
I will just argue. Oh, go ahead. I'll just say that the other piece that also cracked me up about the whole time is that the things that people complained about from the sort of, the reactionary regressive types is the very thing we're asking for, which is, they would say, well, why is this free? Why is this available to everyone? Why are we giving out shots to everyone? And I would, and I think we were all like, yeah, we should just do this all the time. Like, that's exactly the point, right? Like, we pay tax dollars. It should go towards making sure we all have what we need. And so I just think like the other pieces that the pandemic should have made clear that like the ease at which people were able to try to tackle the pandemic by getting access. I mean, like all the things you're saying as problems, yes, but at the end of the day, anybody had access to the shot. Everybody, there were, too late, often too reactionary, but they were making it easy to get tests, right? They were sending it to people. Imagine if we sent kits to people when they got sick. Imagine if we sent kits to people when they had newborns. This is a common thing that other countries do. And we could be doing, and Massachusetts could be doing.
Sorry.
Okay.
I was
just saying also that we could be doing it with other states. If we're too scared to do it with other states, by ourselves, why aren't we asking questions of California, in New York, in Vermont, and saying, let's go in this together? We're worried about the size. I hear this all the time. I'm worried about the size of Massachusetts. There is nothing stopping one legislator, two legislators, 4, 5, 10 legislators to call up their colleagues in other states and say, let's propose a bill together. Nothing. There's nothing stopping them from doing this.
Yeah, but also there is nothing preventing Massachusetts from passing Medicare for all, right? So I've talked to people, even people who, are like deeply immersed in politics, and they say, well, that's not a state issue, that's a national issue. And I'm like, what are you like? No, this is a state issue. Like, we could literally pass it in Massachusetts for 7 million people. And I don't know, our listeners probably already know this, but many people do not know that any state could pass a full Medicare for all of their residents.
I'll use the hook of things for all of the residents to talk about one other issue is thinking about is really what the education system in Massachusetts should look like long term, of knowing that that whether it's kind of the pre-K to higher ed of this full spectrum, and I'd even say like kind of the adult education continuing spectrum stuff needs more attention than it gets as well. When we shouldn't be proud of the number one that we tend to have when it comes to the cost of childcare in this state. And so like being able to do a better job of investing in childcare and early education so it doesn't cost as much as private college tuition for many people
I'm gonna jump in and say that I was once looking for a job in Iowa, and my son was 4 at the time, and I found out that Iowa has free pre-K for children 4 years old, which we don't even have here in Massachusetts.
Yeah, and it's something it's just something that seems so basic, especially with recognizing it both. And there are benefits to the children. There are going to be benefits. There are benefits to society. There are benefits to the parents, particularly because it's like becomes an issue of women's ability to participate in the workforce. If you don't have access to that, as well as especially like I often think of this just K to 12, where we often rank highly for our public school system, but it's a very unequal kind of spread that like we can rank highly because like Wellesley gives a great school district, like Concord has a great school district, Lexington has a great school district, and they're probably like very much above what other states have. But that's not every single municipality in the state. And every student should be able to get the quality of education that you get in the most affluent communities, as well as the recognition, I'd say like on two parts of one, of the need to actually fully implement the funding formula changes that the legislature passed to make that a reality, but also of recognizing how funding alone, like that you need more than just funding for the communities that struggle the most, because what they lack in addition to like the same resources is the same support systems around education that you will get in other kind of in more affluent communities, especially, and like which even connects to economic issues that I often think of when one thing that you have in a lot of higher income communities is parents who have the disposable time, like the available time to spend on their child's education, which is a different thing that like you can care about your child's education, but if you don't have time, the time doesn't translate into something else. And if you're working 3 jobs because you can't afford to live somewhere otherwise, you don't have the ability to invest that time in like keeping track of your child's educational progress, which again kind of speaks to, we can go a lot through investing more, but it also speaks to addressing all of the issues around that, as well as the kind of like community stability issues, making even like on housing, so you're not so the kids don't have to constantly move schools if that's the type of situation. As well as even when it comes to say the higher education spectrum, as well, of making sure that that people don't have to graduate from a public college or university with debt, to make sure that faculty and staff are paid well, like particularly with adjuncts. I'm always horrified by the rise of like the adjunctification, if that's the correct word, of faculty, where it's the kind of where universities increasingly realize that they don't like paying the cost of a tenured professor, and the way they can get around with that is just not having people ever go on tenure track, so that they can just keep them as adjuncts and have people hop around between universities, which is a terrible economic model for anybody other than those seeking to cut costs. Which, on that point, one thing that I think is actually works across different issues is that for most of the time, as I saw this the other day when reading about how Elon Musk is just not paying rent for buildings that Twitter is occupying, that so much of the time what is important to recognize is, in many times when we talk about cutting costs, it typically means firing people, doing less, or stealing.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
That's great.
And they're like, the only thing beyond that is cutting out a middleman. That can be like a positive. Let's say like you could bring down insurance, like healthcare costs, if you cut out a middleman. But beyond cutting out like a layer of bureaucracy that doesn't need to exist, it's one of those three.
Because it's never cutting the profits of the shareholders.
Exactly. Which speaks to like that really bad kind of mindset that these exist. And so like that becomes, especially with higher education, that if we aren't investing what we need to, it typically ends up meaning like firing people, so like laying off faculty and staff, doing less, cutting programs, or stealing, which is effectively what adjunctification of staff is. In the same way, like jacking up tuition, you're stealing from people's futures.
Just to again give this personal example, I think I've given on this podcast before. My wife is an adjunct and or a visiting lecturer at a bunch of places. She teaches at 2 universities because she can't afford to stay at one. She finds out if she's getting money 2-3 months before. I mean, not even. So she just found out this week that they are not going to pay her next semester. So for starting in January. Right. So imagine, luckily for us, we have enough stability that we can figure out other things to make up the income loss from that. But if you are a single person, you found out in the middle of December that you won't have income for 4 months. If you're lucky that you have a summer income from the university, which you probably don't. And on top of that, it's also a cost. So when you're on tenure, you're usually going to pay part of the cost for health insurance. Again, we'll get back to health insurance. That's, again, luckily for her, she gets health insurance through me. But if we had to pay for it, she would entirely have to pay for that herself. So that is a way in which you are basically stealing from her and stealing from the economy to pay shareholders at a health insurance company that, you know, could be going towards other things. So, and there is no tenure tracks anywhere in any of these places. They have eliminated them at universities in the attempt to keep down, you know, costs in every which way, and sometimes keep down, you know, I think if we're going to be fair to universities, often because of rising health costs, right? Like that a lot of it is, again, it gets back to this other thing, which is if you are raising healthcare costs, which are anybody predicting 7 to 12% this year, and you run a university, that's probably 20 to 30 jobs that you are paying to service somebody else, shareholders in a different industry, that could be going to making your adjunct tenure, right? Like, so even if you had the best intentions at running a university, how do you like make it work, right? Like make it all square, you know, and try to not make people pay more to come there, right? Like try to keep everything down. You know, your largest cost is health insurance besides paying people.
No,
right?
and I'd say kind of even like uniting these, like I'd say like for all of the attention, like all of the rhetorical attention that we can get from politicians about like addressing the cost of living in Massachusetts, that if you aren't meaningfully taking action to like kind of rein in, eliminate college tuition and the resulting debt, if you're not basically trying to eliminate the whole idea of health insurance, right? Like you're kind of reining that into the point of it not being a thing anymore. Or in the same when it comes to childcare costs, and the many different things you need to do for that, for housing costs. You're not meaningfully addressing it.
Yeah.
And if it's not something, and it's something that even needs like a goal attached to it. I'd say like with childcare, tuition, and healthcare, you could set a goal that we want to for how much you can bring those costs down. With housing, you can't do necessarily like through one or even a handful of policy items fully bring the cost down, but you should be using every tool that you can.
Oh my goodness. Well, these are some of our big dreams. There are so many more dreams, and I'm sure that next year we will get into them. This is the last podcast of the year. Woo! Merry everything to everyone. Happy everything to everybody. Have a great vacation. And we have some exciting stuff for you all coming up in January. We're going to do season 6, the 6, 5, I don't know. We're going to do the next season, whatever that is. And it's going to be even better than ever. So thank you all for listening. We love you, and we will see you in the new year.